So this is where we left off in the last lesson. We are making our web request and we are getting the data and turning it into a JSON dictionary. So now what do we want to do with this information? We need to parse it. Or if you recall from the video where I explained APIs and web requests, that means taking this JSON information and turning it into a usable object for us here in our app code. So to do that, we are going to need a model. We're going to need a class or a structure. And you should recall that by default, we use structures, all right? Unless there's a good reason to use classes. And this is a good example of a good structure because this is just going to be a container for some data. So I'm going to right click on model and say new file. And then I'm going to select Swift file and say next. And we are going to call this simply person and say create. And then we're going to create a struct and the name will be person. And then the fields are going to correspond to the results of this URL request. And we can either take a look at it in Postman if you followed along in the last lesson. Let's go ahead and click on get person and say send. And let's go ahead and put 1 right here at the end too, so we are only getting a single person result. There we go. Or you can do the same thing from the Swappy website. Okay, so let's take a look at the JSON result that we get from this web request. We see a whole bunch of information, name, height, mass, etc. Now, we don't have to use all of this. I'm only going to pick out maybe 6 to 8 attributes that we want to store in our person. We're going to get the name, the height, the mass, the hair color, the birth year, the gender, the home world, films, vehicles, and starships. Okay, so we are going to need properties for each of those, and we want it to correspond to the type that is here in the JSON. So for instance, this is a string, this is an array of strings, and so when we create our properties in our structure, we are going to want those to match up. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to say let name of type string, let height of type string, let mass of type string, let hair of type string, let birth year of type string, let gender of type string, let home world URL of type string, let film URLs, and now this one, remember this is an array of strings. So we have the films key here, and then it's an array of strings. Okay, so this one's going to be just a little bit different. We are going to say an array of type string. And then same thing for vehicle and starship URLs. Let vehicle URLs be of type string, and let starship URLs be of type string array. All right, so now we have our structure. We have our data bag that will hold the information from our JSON. All right, so let's go back into our person API. And now we are going to parse it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and right here below our getRandomPersonURL session function, I'm going to create a new function. And this can be a private function called, and I'm going to call this parse person manual, okay? And we are going to call this right here after we get our JSON. I'm going to delete this print statement here. And so we are going to pass into this parse person manual function this JSON object. So I'm going to say JSON, and this is of type, right here, it's a dictionary of key, string, and value any. So I'm going to say string any. And then the goal is to return from this function as a result a person object. But I'm going to not add this yet because we'll just keep getting this error until we return a person. So I'm going to delete that and we'll add that back later. All right, so let's go ahead and call this function parse person manual right here under the guard let JSON. So I'm going to say parse person manual, and then I'm going to pass into it our JSON dictionary. And because we are in a closure, we need to call self.parsePersonManual. And we'll discuss this probably in the next lesson, why you need to have self within closures. Okay, so we are passing this JSON into this function here. So now what? How do we get the information that we need from this JSON? Well, if you think back to your intro to Swift with Caleb and learning about dictionaries, it's pretty much exactly the same. So if you recall with a dictionary, let's just say we have something like let names equal, and then a dictionary, and you have a key. So I'm going to say name 1, and then a value, Johnny B, and then a comma, and we'll say name 2, and then a comma and a value. For this, we'll say Billie Jean. And so to access the values from this dictionary, you say let Johnny equal names, and then you do open close square brackets, and then you type in the key that you want to access the value for. So Johnny would be names, and then name 1 is the key, and that will give the value for Johnny B, okay? And then the same thing with the second name. It would be let Billy equal names, and then you access the value by the key. So this would be name 2. And it's the same thing as the JSON data that we're getting from Swappy. You see here we have a key and a value. Key and value. And we can access this the same way as we are doing right here with this dictionary. So let's start out with the name. We're going to say let name equal. We're going to say JSON, and we are going to access it by its key. And now this is very important that you type the keys exactly as you see them here in the JSON results, okay? It has to be exactly like this. So I'm going to say JSON name. Now the difference between the dictionaries and this is that we don't know here exactly what type this result is going to be. So we have to cast it as the desired result, which in this case is a string. So we can say as, and we'll do an optional cast just in case it's possible that it fails. So I'm going to say as string, and then we'll provide a default value of just an empty string. So if this fails, then we'll set name equal to just an empty string. And then we're going to do the same thing for the rest of our properties. So I'm going to say let height equal JSON, and then get it via its key, which is height, as string. And if it fails, then we are going to initialize height with just an empty string. And then let mass equal JSON, access it by its key, which is mass, cast it as a string, provide a default value if that fails. Then we have hair, let hair equal JSON, and this one is hair underscore color. And you've heard of camel case. This is what we call snake case, okay? So we have lowercase, and then words are separated by an underscore, okay? So that's called snake case. And again, we're going to optionally cast it as a string and provide a default variable or a default value of an empty string. And then we have birth year. Let birth year equal JSON, and this is birth, oops, it needs to be a string, birth underscore year. Optionally cast it as a string, provide a default empty value. Let gender equal JSON, and gender is the key. cast it as an optional string and provide a empty string default value. And then let home world URL equal JSON. And the key is home world. Optionally cast it as a string and provide a default value. Sorry, I know this is repetitive, but this is the joys of parsing JSON. And then we have let film URLs equal JSON, and the key is films. And this one's going to be slightly different. Remember, this is an array of string, and we will provide a default value of an empty array of strings. Then we have vehicle URLs, and I'm going to save us a little bit of time. I think you've had enough practice typing these out, so I'm going to copy that and paste it, and this is going to be vehicle URLs. The key is vehicles, and the rest is good, and then I'm going to paste that again, and this one is starship URLs, and the key is starships. All right, so now what do we do with all of these variables that this is telling us we're not using? Well, we create an instance from our person structure, okay? So I can say let person equal person, and then we can initialize it. Now there's a bit of a bug here with the Xcode 10 beta. You can see that it's not coming up with the initializer. So unfortunately what you need to do is you can go ahead and do that, and then it's going to say missing argument for parameter, and we go ahead and say fix, and then we can put in name here, and then it's going to tell us that we're missing the argument for height, so you can fix it and press fix, and you just keep on doing this until you get all of the properties. I'll go ahead and go through this, but I'll make sure it's fast forwarded for you. Okay, once you have all of your properties in your initializer, what we can do is we can add back that return here. So we want this function to return a person object, and then we can say return this person that we just initialized, okay? Or you can do shorthand, and instead of initializing a variable and then returning it, all we have to do is say return that person that is initialized. All right, so then up here where we have self.parsePersonManual, we are passing it the JSON, and then we go through and we extract from that JSON dictionary each of the properties that we need to initialize our person. We initialize the person object, the instance, and then we return it back into here. So I'm going to say let person equal the result of this function that is returned, and then we can use this person instance. So I can say something like print person.name, print person.film URLs, and if we run this, we see here in the results Luke Skywalker, so this is person.name, and then we have this array of strings, and this is the film URLs. So that is pretty awesome. We have made our network request, we've gotten back the JSON, and then we have parsed it into an instance, an object of our person structure that we are able to use efficiently. So now you may be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but how do we get this person into our select person VC so that we can update our UI, right? Well, first thing we're going to need is our IB outlets hooked up to our select person VC, right? So I'm going to open up the storyboard in our assistant editor. I'm going to hold Option and click on main.storyboard. And I'm going to close this bottom pane, close the document outline to get us some more room. And right here, I'm going to start adding our IB outlets. So for the name, I'm going to control and drag over and say name label, connect. I'm going to grab the height label, control and drag and connect and say height label and say connect. For the mass, I'm going to control and drag and say mass label and connect. For the hair, I'm going to control and drag and let go and say hair label. And for the birth year, I'm going to control and drag and say birth year label and connect. And for the gender label, I'm going to control and drag and say gender label and connect. All right, so now we have our IB outlets. I'm going to close our assistant editor and let's come back to our person API.swift. And now you might be thinking that, well, all we need to do is return our person from this function. So let's try that. I'm going to say return a person. And right here, after we get back our person instance from our parsing function, I'm going to say return person, okay? But there's a problem. Remember when we were talking about asynchronous functions, meaning that we don't know how long a network request could take? And so what would happen is if we tried to use this function and return a person here, we would say person.api, get random person URL session, and then we would try to use the result to set our UI labels. However, step one would be make network request. So it would start the request, but then immediately after, it would try to use the expected person result. However, that person result hasn't been populated by the internet yet because it's an asynchronous request and our code runs synchronously, meaning it will just send off the network request and then immediately it would try to use that person object to populate the UI labels, and we're probably going to get a crash because there won't be any values to populate. And so this is where closures and completion handlers come in, which we will be discussing in the next lesson, all right? So I'll see you then.